Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, the show where brilliant professionals share how to sharpen the universal skills required to flourish at work. Enjoy more career fun, wins, meaning, and money with your host, Pete Makaitis.
Hello, and welcome to episode 908 with David Livermore. David has some excellent poise and grace and wisdom and nuance when it comes to having tricky conversations, particularly when they're around heated issues or some polarized opinion sorts of matters. David's got the goods. So if you've ever been a little shy, sensitive, unsure, timid about going there or speaking up, David's got some great tools and wisdom and perspective for us. So you'll learn 1, why we're better off when we address our differences. 2, how to overcome the discomfort of discussing differences. And 3, the one question that helps bridge divides. So if you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've mentioned, please visit us at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP908. And if you're hanging out at awesomeatyourjob.com, great idea, I encourage you to check out our Gold Nugget email summaries. These give you a summary write-up of the actionable wisdom each guest shares. And they go to your inbox directly in the morning each episode goes live. So you have a little summary rundown there. You also unlock the whole vault archive of all 908 of these summaries when you sign up for the Gold Nuggets. It's totally free. So check it out at awesomeatyourjob.com, those gold nuggets. Now here's a bit about David. David Livermore PhD is a social scientist devoted to the study of cultural intelligence, CQ if you will, and global leadership, and the author of several award-winning books. He is a founder of the Cultural Intelligence Center in East Lansing, Michigan, and a visiting research fellow at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Prior to leading the Cultural Intelligence Center, Livermore spent 20 years in leadership positions with a variety of nonprofits and taught at 5 universities. He's a frequent speaker and advisor to leaders in Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, and governments, and has worked in more than 100 countries. He's been interviewed and referenced by myriad news sources, including the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, New York Times, USA Today, and many more. So big thanks to David for sharing his wisdom with us, and big thanks to our sponsor, Dash Hudson. If you do marketing work or manage social media, it can feel totally overwhelming navigating the ever-changing social media landscape. Great marketers need access to the latest insights and best practices to thrive without spending eons of time keeping up with the latest of everything. A great resource for that is Dash Hudson's Social Media Trends Report. Dash Hudson is a social media management platform that delivers sophisticated insights and workflow tools. Dash Hudson is trusted by thousands of brands like United Airlines, Rare Beauty, and P&G. It keeps you in the know and saves you time. And now they are proud to offer their highly anticipated Social Media Trends Report. This free report unveils the social media industry's leading trends and insights. And one of my favorite insights there was that creators who post on behalf of a brand on Instagram had 16 times the engagement rate as compared to those brands who went direct, natively engaging on Instagram. So nice job, influencers. Looks like you're influential after all. And that's just a good thing to know. You can learn that and a whole lot more by downloading their trends report and signing up for a free 14-day trial of Dash Hudson today at dashhudson.com/podcast. That's spelled DASHHUDSON.com/podcast. Now, here's David. David, welcome to How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
Thanks, Pete.
Well, I'm excited to dig into the wisdom of your book, Digital, Diverse, and Divided, How to Talk to Racists, Compete with Robots, and Overcome Polarization, to help folks become more awesome at their jobs. But first, I want to hear a cool story from you about maybe a time you and a friend had some opposite views, but came to a really cool mutual understanding.
Oh, wow. We're going right in, right? Yeah. So there are many. I'm thinking about a conversation that I had with someone right after the first Trump election. So to jump right into politics, without me really getting too far into the weeds of it, we voted differently, and we were having lunch together the next day and kind of started around like, I can't believe this. And well, what, because you didn't get your candidate to win. And so we were kind of bantering for a while. And then we started to talk about, okay, let's put everything on hold here for a moment. What's most important to you and me? And we were both dads. We are both dads. We started to talk about that. And thankfully, by the time we ended the conversation, I think we both decided the world wasn't going to come to an end, though we still retained some of the concerns that each of us had related to our politics. So that was the first of many conversations with him and other people about kind of my feelings about politics and issues related to diversity, reproductive rights, and on the list could go.
All right. And you remain friends to this day?
We absolutely do.
All right. Okay. What I found troubling during some of those contentious elections were the proclamations like, if you voted this way, then you can unfriend me right now because we have nothing in common. I was like, oh, that feels like the opposite of what we need to do here, is kind of my intuition. It sounds like you're on my wavelength.
Yeah. And I mean, Pete named the issue of the week. We kind of get some kind of that. I'm watching it right now as we're watching, at least at the time of recording, the atrocities going on in the Middle East. And it's the same kind of rhetoric that's being there. Like, just unfriend me now if you believe X. And like, okay, how does that help any of us move forward? So yeah, I think you're right. Our unwillingness to even be friends, quote unquote, on social media with someone who has a differing viewpoint is clearly a problem.
That's right. Well, to counterpoint that, David, the social media friendship is one of the most intimate and sacred relationships that we have. So, in all fairness,
no, fair enough that you say that, because when the book first came out, people were often asking me about how do you work through some of these like conflicts you have with people, and I'm like, well, I'll tell you one thing, it's not on social media. And I swear a couple of weeks later, I suddenly found myself in a very cantankerous debate with someone on social media. I'm like, I just violated my own principles. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Part of the problem is if we assume there's going to be meaningful, constructive debate on social media, we're probably already off on the wrong foot.
All right. Well, maybe before we get too much into all these fascinating alleys and corridors, could you make the case, David, for why does understanding this stuff help a person be more awesome at their job?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because most of my work has actually been oriented around how it helps people be awesome at their job. And then I kind of backward designed it into how does it also relate to personal relationships. So a little bit of context to that response. Most of my work is in the field of cultural intelligence. So how do you understand people who come from different cultural backgrounds? So in the job context, usually what that has meant is, hey, you're part of a team that's scattered across Europe, Asia, and the US. How do you just deal with some of the frustrations of not only time zones, but different ways of getting work done, et cetera? And the longer that I got engaged in that work, the more I was observing just at a personal level, some of these increasingly polarizing conversations that happen in our own neighborhoods, maybe even in our own extended families, and started to say, how can we actually use some of these same principles that you might work in the work sphere in personal relationships? So I would say you're hard pressed today to be engaged in a work environment that isn't going to be working with people who have different viewpoints than you and different backgrounds than you. And we can try and stuff it for a while, but particularly under stress and time pressure, it's going to start to surface. And the better that we learn the skills for how to actually lean into our differences and use those rather than ignore them is going to be helpful for all of us to become more awesome at the work that we're doing.
Well, I'd love to get your take in terms of these sorts of conversations, if they are political or other sort of hot button or divisive, controversial matters. To what extent ought we not talk about them at work versus absolutely engage, bring your whole self, your whole person? How do you think about that ball of wax?
Yeah, I'm a classic academic, so I'm going to say it depends on the situation, right? Because in part, we've been told, particularly in U.S. work culture, more the first point, like just leave it alone, don't go near politics, don't touch that. But that's become harder and harder to do, particularly when some of the politicized issues are around unionization or around reproductive rights or whether or not people should be working from home or not, et cetera. So it's not realistic to say that this is never going to come up. And in the wake of some of the atrocities that were happening after the George Floyd murder, like sometimes people of color were sitting there on a Zoom call going, everybody's asking how my weekend was. I don't even know how to engage in this conversation because I'm still reeling emotionally.
Yeah, I hear you. It's like, well, this thing happened and it was horrifying for me. Right. Am I supposed to say that or am I supposed to not say that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it comes down to what a lot of our friends in the DEI space say of creating psychologically safe environments where we're not walking on eggshells, where it's okay to voice a different viewpoint, but being mindful that there may be someone on the other side of the table who has a very different opinion and takes a special kind of leader to know how to create awesome teams who can handle that kind of intellectual honesty with each other.
Okay. Now we settled that. Thank you. So can you share with us any particularly surprising or fascinating discoveries that might be sort of counterintuitive as you dug into this work and put together the book?
Yeah, a couple things. So the first would come more from our broader realm of research in cultural intelligence. One of the things that was surprising to me is sometimes those who know a lot about the other side, whether the other side be how a German works versus an American, or whether it be a Republican versus a Democrat, actually sometimes do worse than those who don't know a lot. And what emerged in the research in that is if I think I know a whole lot about you, then that can tend to make me arrogant and closed-minded and think, oh, I already know how people like you think. So it was a bit counterintuitive for someone like me who's an academic to go, actually, knowledge by itself can be dangerous. But when combined with the other facets that we look at in cultural intelligence, to what degree are you open and motivated? How do you actually strategize? How does that actually help it? The one that was more specific to the book and looking at how do we actually use these ideas to help us around some of these polarizing issues was surrounding an issue that we call in the academic arena perspective taking. So your listeners can certainly wrap their minds around it pretty quickly. Perspective taking is just when I stop and say, let me see this through your point of view. And so there was some interesting research where Adam Galinsky at Columbia University, a colleague of mine, wanted to look at what happened when he asked a group of students to examine an elderly gentleman sitting outside on a chair in New York City. And the first group of students, he just said, write what you see. The second group of students, he said, write what you see, but avoid negative stereotypes. The third group of students, he said, write what you see, but I want you to write it in the first person as if you're the elderly gentleman. And what happened? The first group of students with no parameters, they wrote all kinds of stereotypical things about this poor, dithering man who's been here and is losing his mind, is lonely. Second group of students, it was relatively clinical. He sits here every day. He's been here for lots of years. The third group of students who were asked to view it through the first person, they wrote the most humanizing, positive view of, oh, I've had such a rich life and I've watched some of the same kids grow up on these blocks, etc. And so it became a very useful kind of somewhat surprising finding of a simple trick to say, what if I actually enter the mind of someone who views vaccines as the best or worst thing ever and start to think about, could I argue their point of view from their perspective?
Yeah, that it really is powerful for just about any issue in terms of, because it's easy to judge and to demonize, but then if you put yourself into a position of a mother had triplets, they got vaccines, and then they all developed autism days afterwards, what is she to conclude? What is she to think? And she's terrified. And so that's going to be the perspective she's going to have, is like, hey, vaccines are risky.
Great. And shouting at her with the science isn't even addressing the fear that she feels at that point as a mother.
Certainly.
But it's also super hard, right? Like, because the minute we start to view that other viewpoint, we immediately start to put, oh yeah, these clueless sheeple who think blah, blah, blah. Like, hang on, just you're them right now. How do they view it?
That's right. Like, I'm a clueless sheeple. That's not what they're thinking.
Right. Probably not.
Okay. Well, so then lay it on us. Is there a key theme or thesis that enables us to both talk to racists or compete with robots and overcome polarization? Is there a master key, David? Teeing you up.
Well, thank you for that question, Pete. I would say that one of the solutions to it is coming at it through this research-based work that I've done on cultural intelligence. And that is, if we were to exercise with our racist uncle the same kind of perspective that we might exercise being with someone on the other side of the world, maybe we would get a little further along. And to be a bit more concrete about it, the first thing we know about just being more effective when you're traveling or working with someone from a different cultural background is just openness. Am I open to considering a different way of doing things? So one of the tangible things that I suggest to people in the book, but just more practically and in my interactions with my own friends and people that I'm working with in organizations, is if somebody has a strong opinion that differs from yours, like my friend did related to the example you asked a few minutes ago, just simply asking the question, are you willing to consider a different perspective? And very rarely will someone go, hell no. And if they do, then there's really no point in going any further, because if someone has just said, no, I'm absolutely closed-minded to hear anything more you have to say, then don't waste your breath. You might actually make it worse. But if there's at least okay, sure, I'll at least listen to a different perspective. That's kind of an inroad. And of course, coming back to the perspective taking thing, it requires that I'm willing to do the same. Am I willing to do that? And then the other key thing I would say that really try and bring out in the work that we do with people to be awesome at their jobs and the kinds of things we write about in the book is to find a shared problem that we both care about. Like, if it's in the work setting, we both have to meet this deadline for this client. So you might think the best way to go about it is A, and I think is B. But at the end of the day, we got to figure out how to get this done so that they're pleased and they want to continue to do business with us, et cetera. So zooming wider than a my way versus yours to what's the shared problem we're trying to solve, and then actually trying to use our different viewpoints of can we actually come up with a better solution by both of us contributing to it, found that can be a way that helps unlock people's kind of closed-minded nature toward it to actually getting fixated on something that's a little bigger than just our individual differences.
And David, could you share a cool story of some teams, some folks in the workplace using some of this stuff to have some cool breakthroughs?
Yeah. So one example that comes to mind is we did quite a bit of work for a while with Goldman Sachs. And in particular, there were many of their individuals in their Asian offices in Tokyo, Beijing, Singapore, et cetera, who felt like they were continually being passed over for promotions by people in London and New York. And so they were hitting what often gets talked about as the bamboo ceiling. They weren't being assertive in the way that perhaps their Western counterparts wanted them to do so. So we began to design a whole 4-month program that would talk about how do you take on a different perspective? How do you kind of change the way that you voice things? And so a really concrete way that we worked with them on it is they had to leave a voicemail, leaving the same information for 3 different individuals, sort of the caricature of somebody who was in New York, the caricature of someone who was in London, and the caricature of someone in Japan. Same information, but how do you communicate it differently? Of course, we caution against stereotyping and all that, but then gave them some feedback on, okay, if I'm your stereotypical New Yorker, here's the way I heard that message sound. So this goes broader than just the how do you work across polarization, but how do you actually develop this skill set in your job to be able to more effectively communicate in ways that people are going to hear things differently based upon their background and perspective.
Intriguing. So in this exercise, they were delivering it in a way they were imagining a stereotypical New Yorker or Londoner would want to receive it.
Correct.
It's like, I'm just hearing accents in my head as I'm imagining this exercise.
Okay. No, not that.
Can you share with me some actual content? Like what might that sound like and how that difference goes?
Yeah, no, fair question. Well, I'm speaking more about the words that are spoken and the level of assertiveness. So with New York, no surprise that it'd be very direct, to the point, succinct, get the word out quickly. Whereas in the UK, London, still, not overly obtuse, but, perhaps a little bit more deferential, showing a little bit more respect for authority. And then all the more so with the Japanese example, all kinds of deference, more indirect. So it was more the nuance of how you communicate this in a way that you would be perceived to be competent, confident, assertive, and all those kinds of things, but not over the top where like, who is this dude that's leaving me this voicemail that sounds like they're arrogant or something else?
That's good. And I'm thinking about your magical question there. Are you open to considering another perspective? And I can hear that it's rare they're going to say no way, no how, no, not ever. Although I think if I am being honest and I've got a good relationship with someone, I might say, I'd rather not do that today, but I'm not in the headspace today for that.
And I think that's actually a super mature response in some cases. Like, yes, someday, but today is not a good day for that,
Certainly. Do you have any other favorite or least favorite words and phrases that are very productive or very destructive in these contexts?
Well, least favorite, but then I'll counterpoint it with what I would add to it. The minute you say that makes no sense, it's derogatory, it's dismissive. And so I just encourage people to say, just add to me. That makes no sense to me. Like, we don't need to be super like we're walking on eggshells and, oh, Pete, I'm not sure I entirely get that. But like, it's fair for us to banter and say, that makes no sense to me. Help me understand it. But to just, that makes no sense, sounds like you're not logical, you don't make any sense, etc. So that's another one that I like. I think I already said this in our interview earlier, but Another favorite phrase of mine, and it's one that I'm often known for, is it depends. When somebody's like, should it be this or this? Well, it depends on so many different factors. I think it's fair for people when I'm facilitating a session in the workplace or something for them to say, it depends on what? Like, it's not fair for me to just walk out of the room and go, it depends. But there's far too much of our workplace advice, our advice for how you overcome polarization that's super dogmatic. And it's like, what's the nature of the relationship? I mean, you just mentioned it. You said, well, it would depend on the friend and the relationship I have with them. Exactly. There'd be some individuals where you might say, not today, I'm not open, okay? I'm just shooting straight with you. Like, this is not a good day for me to enter the perspective of how you're feeling about this. So those are a few of my favorites.
Yeah. Okay. And so generally speaking, cultural intelligence, what are your pro tips for how folks go about cultivating it and improving in this set of skills?
It won't surprise you that there's no substitute for developing cultural intelligence other than direct experience, so actually interacting with people who have different backgrounds than you. And so to come back to your example of when we unfriend someone, whether virtually or in real life, just because they have a different perspective, like there's very little hope we're going to develop this skill set if we don't purposely put ourselves in places where we're interacting with people who are different. We could say that when we're talking about the more full-on cultural standpoint, the same would be if I'm not interacting with people from different races, ethnicities, as well as people on other sides of the world. Along with that, there is all kinds of research that says that formal education, we tend to see that as people get engaged in, higher level thinking and that it actually does have a link to cultural intelligence. Many of your listeners may be very familiar with the idea of emotional intelligence. That is the ability to monitor and detect my own emotional state and the emotional state of another person. We know that that's a key part of how you develop cultural intelligence, because if I'm not first self-aware or aware of the emotions of people from similar backgrounds, there's very little hope that I'm going to do it with other individuals. So those are a few that are there. Oh, one more that I should just mention, obviously, absolutely key, is just starting with a self-awareness of what's my own identity, what's my own ideology. Can I, transcend a little bit, get engaged in a bit of meta cultural intelligence, if you will, to take a look at myself and say, how am I myself shaped by my background, my upbringing, the profession that I'm in, the people that I hang out with, etc.
I'm curious to hear your perspective when folks, they hear, that it probably is a wise move to talk to people who have the opposite point of view than me in some things. And maybe they'll make the determination for, it's kind of too risky to start at work or with this team or with this individual. But if there is a sense of terror associated with putting forth a perspective and hearing another person's perspective that's the opposite, like, I actually think that abortion is murder. It's like, okay, I was like, if people feel terrified to voice their view or the opposite view, it's like, I think that it is oppressive to say abortions are forbidden. Then how do you recommend folks dip their toe in? Like, I think in some ways, these muscles, these skills have sort of atrophied in recent years as folks see the fireworks fly and they shrink from that. Say, okay, duly noted. That results in very spooky conversations and consequences. I'm not going to go there. And if we want to develop the cultural intelligence, it sounds like going there is part of the game. So how do you recommend we do that in a way that seems lower risk and higher safety?
I think one part of it is realizing we can't go there with everyone. So because someone just says it in line in the supermarket behind us doesn't mean that we're not being true to our convictions if we don't engage it. And a more realistic example, like you said, just because someone might quip about that in a team meeting now may not be the time. So it's kind of say, who are the people with whom I really want to engage in this? And then it's probably an offline conversation. Hey, let's grab a drink together. Let's have a meal together. And I'd love to talk about this further. And this is where I would suggest we take on some of these tools that I've mentioned throughout of, okay, would you be open to considering a different perspective rather than just automatically assuming that it's oppressive or assuming that it's murder? Could you voice a perspective that somebody who is religiously similar to you and has a similar view of life, how they could actually arrive at a place that makes abortion legal as compared to you? So sort of coming at it that way of forcing each other to not go to these sound bites. So I realize easier said than done, but I think finding a few individuals with whom we can go deeper on is probably going to be a lot better than us thinking that on an offhanded comment or a quick social media post, we're really going to get people to either change their perspective or get us to rethink ours.
And what sounds so powerful about this in terms of from the cultural intelligence, if you engage in these practice multiple times, then you'll have a greater confidence, courage, capability to disagree with folks about issues that may not be hot button cultural issues, but just like, you think your boss is absolutely headed down the wrong path with this initiative. It's like you have developed some reps of going there with folks in terms of saying, hey, are you open to considering a new perspective on the trajectory of this project? And then all of that emotional stuff, you've worked through it a number of times.
I love that example, Pete, because I think that does bring it closer to home. Because for many of us, it may feel daunting to dive into the deep end of reproductive rights or Hamas versus Israel or whatever the timely issue is. But clearly starting with some kind of, hey, on a team when we have a different view of how quickly should we be out to market or how much time should we spend consulting with 75 other people before we decide which campaign we're going to roll out as a marketing team, practicing some of these within a team on lower stake in terms of emotionally lower stake issues is a great way to think about it. And to your point that the two are connected. It's why I talk about cultural intelligence, which may seem adrift to people of like, wait, why are you talking about Germany versus Americans at the same breath as you're talking about Trump versus Biden or January 6th? Well, some of those same muscles get exercised of, okay, I have a very different perspective that I've been socialized into seeing the world as do you. How do we use some of these same kind of techniques that can be used, whether we're talking about cultural issues or whether we're talking about ideological ones or political ones?
And David, zooming into the heat of battle, if you're hearing some things or having a conversation and you can feel yourself getting riled up, your defensiveness or judgment, this guy is an idiot, it's like whatever that internal voice sounds like, do you have sort of a stop, drop, and roll or an immediate prescription for when you're in the moment and you're starting to feel some intense feelings that are at risk for derailing your logical of thinking abilities? What do you do?
A couple thoughts. One is, this is why I said emotional intelligence is a piece of it, is I do have to know myself enough to know, am I going to be able to engage in this in any kind of constructive way? And if, my heart rate's going and I'm starting to think about 4-letter words that I want to call you, then probably better to be like, you know what? Kind of back to your strategy, now's not the day for us to talk about this, but I'd like to engage in it. The other thing I think is really important for me to acknowledge, people can't see me, but if they look me up at all, I'm a white, straight, middle-aged guy. And so some might say, okay, fine, Dave, for you to say that I should confront a racist bigot or whatever else. But what if you're the person who's continually on the receiving end of discrimination, bigotry, bias? I absolutely give people an opt-in or opt-out of saying, hey, it might not be your job to say today's the day that I'm going to school the manager on how what they just did was a microaggression in that. So I think this does need to be something that is opt-in. I'm not campaigning for everyone that you all need to, every time you hear something, you need to come up and challenge it and have a culturally intelligent conversation. There may be times where any of us are not in an emotional state to do that. And all the more so if you're somebody has a very visceral reaction to this because of something in your own identity or a personal life experience, you may need to opt out and let someone else be the one who jumps in and takes the flak for it.
And I was just going to ask, if you are on the receiving end of some, I don't know, just rude, ignorant, discriminatory, just bad news comments, what do you recommend you do in response? It sounds like it depends. But if you could share with us maybe some of the different contexts that suggest different responses.
Quick story, if you will, and I'll come at it that way initially. So a number of years ago, the university where I was on a task force, and one of my colleagues also on the task force was a woman who always advocated for the importance of opportunities for women in leadership, staff, faculty, students, et cetera. And this task force I was on, the individual chairing the meeting, he knew that that was sort of Christy's like hobby horse, even though it wasn't her formal role. So he was just making every sexist statement in the book to just sort of push her buttons. Oh, Christy, why don't you take the minutes for us? And how come you didn't bring us cupcakes today? And I'm just like, dude. And she didn't say a word. So kind of coming back to what do you respond? She engaged in the meeting professionally in light of her role at the university, but she didn't like engage in this banter at all. She's a pretty good friend. So I walk out of the meeting with her when it's done. And I'm like, Christy, I can't believe you took that. And she's like, yeah, I was hoping you would say something. And I'm like, ah. And, so now I feel a little defensive. I'm like, wait a second. How is that not like the white male riding into like, don't say that to my friend Christy? She's like, no, I didn't need you to defend me. I needed you to speak up on your own behalf of how you feel about that kind of banter and the role of women, et cetera. And so it was a real reminder to me of when we hear all this, buzz about allyship, but that was a moment of what allyship would look like is hopefully there's somebody else who can speak up, and it shouldn't have been on her to have to speak into it. And, sometimes people will say to me like, isn't it a little awkward being a white, straight, middle-aged guy talking about all this stuff? And I'm like, I don't pretend for a moment to know that I have the lived experience of many of the groups that I care passionately about promoting inclusion and equity for, but there's a role for me to play leveraging power, et cetera, in ways that others might not have it. So I guess it's to think about that you're not in it alone. Who are others that can help you with it? And if you're on the receiving end, it's back to where I go, opt in carefully. And if your mental health can't handle it, you have my full support if you say, it's not on me to challenge, the bigotry that's going on right now. I need to just protect my own sanity in it.
And I suppose then in that context, there's multiple ways that you can engage that challenge. You might bring that up right then and there in the meeting, or you might chat with boss afterwards, like, hey, the cupcake stuff is like, some people will probably think it's funny, but other people will really don't. So just heads up.
I think that's a great point. And I would say my preference overall, based upon my personality, but also what I think helps people be awesome at work, is to do it offline rather than shame them. I guess the counterpoint I would offer to it is there's also a message that's being sent to everyone else in the group. If perhaps I was the leader and somebody else on the team was doing that, I think there would be some, not necessarily shaming, but some kind of intervention that's needed right in the moment that demonstrates to the team, this is not the kind of behavior that we want to be part of what we're doing. And I think you could still do it in a way that isn't like shame on you, individual, but hey, we might all like be tired and sarcastic and think we're doing funny, but we're about an inch away from when it's funny and when it's actually offensive to people. So to your point, it depends, as there are myriad ways you could confront it. But for those of us who at work are in leadership roles, I think there's a different level of responsibility on us to call it out, even publicly, for the benefit of what everybody else is observing and learning from it.
And David, if you do feel sort of excluded in the sense that it's clear that your views or identity or whatever is not welcome or respected. I guess there's some environments where it's just sort of like, don't you dare wear a MAGA hat in this room, or the opposite. Don't you dare wear a Biden shirt in that room. So I guess I wonder about the extent of, it probably varies person by person. Like, is that just sort of okay? Or should we speak up? It's just like, something that I believe strongly is completely unwelcome in this room. And that's just how it is. And I'm just going to live my life and not bring that up. Versus, do you think we miss out on a lot of good people engagement, whole self at work stuff when we're in that vibe?
I think we do miss out. Like, I realize it's idealistic for me to say that in every case, you ought to just speak up and be your whole self and be authentic. And there are certainly cases where I would say if you don't have the right power, or if you just feel like this is just going to be misconstrued and it's pointless, I give people all kinds of agency to figure out what bringing their whole selves to work is. But I do think the team and the organization's missing out, because if you use the example you used of Biden and Trump, look at the polls, regardless of whether or not you think they're legitimate. The fact that we could even be close to a margin of error of 50-50 on Trump versus Biden shows that, if we have a whole room of people that thinks somebody of the other perspective is not welcome here, well, then we've just cut off half the country. So wouldn't we be better to somehow be informed by that perspective, whether it's from a business idea, whether it's a way of developing a better product for people or whatever it might be. So I'm going to very much lead on at least the ideal is it's better if we can speak that up, at least in certain cases. But I recognize that as individuals, we have to pick our battles wisely and may say, I just don't have the energy to go at this again if I'm the lone one debating this with everybody else.
And I think you brought up a wise point there with regard to the 50-50 is, I guess I'm surprised at how often people seem to say things which suggest they're assuming everybody in the room holds their same views.
Right.
Or they don't care at all. They're just going to say it out loud and proud and deal with it.
I mean, I think of this often even, which no surprise, but even when you hear it on media interviews, Americans want, which Americans, But then likewise, like sometimes even I'll meet a stranger in an Uber, the driver, or on an airplane, and the assumptions that they're making of me after like 3 minutes of talking about my presumed agreement with them about their political perspective. I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So it's actually one of the things I mentioned to you before we started the interview. I recently moved to San Diego, and I came here from the Midwest, a very conservative sort of community, politically conservative. And I think, everybody there was like, you're moving to the left coast. Are you ready for this? But San Diego actually has quite a bit of political diversity, I think, because of the military presence. And it's actually one of the things I've really enjoyed here is most social gatherings, as well as professional that I end up with, you can't just assume that because someone lives in this town, they're voting one way or the other, or even because they're military, that they might feel one way or the other about Trump or Biden. So I think we're richer people, communities, and workplaces when we create space for that. But I'm with you. It's amazing to me how often people you couched it by saying either they think that or they just don't care. And I think both are probably viable hypotheses of why individuals do that.
Well, David, tell me, anything else you want to make sure to mention before we shift gears and hear about some of your favorite things?
I think I would just encourage people to have the difficult conversations, because I think we learn so much from that. And it's much easier to just default to people who think, believe, vote the same way we do. But there's this vast, fascinating country or world that's out there. So have a conversation with someone who views an issue differently than you and see what comes of it.
All right. Well, now could you share a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
So I'm going to have to use one that I actually use at the very beginning of the Digital Diverse and Divided book. It's from the great Martin Luther King Jr., who says, people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. For me, that kind of says really well what I'm after. A lot of this is driven by fear, and fear of people that we don't really know at a deep level because we aren't talking.
All right. And can you share a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
For someone like me, a favorite bit of research is a tough question, but one I've been thinking about a lot lately is there's this whole body of research around you see what you pay attention to. And so just this kind of idea of I'm paying attention to certain things in my life, and that directly impacts the way I view life. There's all kinds of research on if you pay attention to, negative things, you tend to have a more negative orientation. So that field is outside my own expertise, but is one that really fascinates me.
And a favorite book?
Favorite book. So I'm actually going to say Abraham Verghese, Cutting for Stone, which is just a brilliant novel that I love.
Okay. And a favorite tool, something you use to be awesome at your job?
I am an obsessive journaler, and it's something that I do almost every morning. It's the way that I work through problems. It's the way that I reflect on things, make meaning out of things. So for me, journaling is an absolutely essential skill for both productivity and just making sense of my life.
And a favorite nugget you share, something that really seems to connect and resonate with folks that they quote back to you often?
I think I would say that amid all of our differences that I'm really keened in on helping people pay attention to, but that at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And so calling people to our shared humanity, not instead of our differences, but alongside of our differences. That's something I found that has really resonated to people. And pulling from the Human Genome Project that tells us we're 99.9% the same DNA, I find that in the space of talking about differences, polarization, diversity, and working around the world is a piece that really sort of resonates with people of like, oh yeah, as Livermore says, we have this shared humanity that needs to shape the way that we interact and live.
All right. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
DavidLivermore.com is the easiest place to start.
Okay. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Thanks so much, Pete. It's really great to be able to interact with people who are thinking deeply about how they just do their work better and live better. And my challenge is going to harken back to what I said to you earlier. Have a conversation with someone who has a different opinion to you and see what you learn.
All right. Well, David, thank you for this. I wish you many enriching conversations.
Thanks so much, Pete.
I love David's little shift in language from "that makes no sense," which creates rage, to "that makes no sense to me. Can you help me understand it?" Oh, creates understanding. I love a tiny shift in language that makes a world of difference. Great stuff from David. Again, the show notes, the transcript, and the links to items that we've referenced are found at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP908. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.